Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the conclusion of our Beethoven Symphony Countdown. And this particular video gives you 2 for the price of 1. You get a bonus. We're going to be looking at the first 2 symphonies together. Symphonies 1 and 2. And there are a couple of reasons for that, which I think are sensible and practical, and you can make up your own mind how you feel about them. The first is that they often come coupled together on a single disc, which is a convenient way to get them. The second is that there are virtually no performances in which a good performance of number 1 is not accompanied by an equally good performance of number 2, and vice versa. They really tend to go well together. And the third reason is that listening to them in tandem is an excellent way to understand how Beethoven was heading towards the revolution, which was Symphony number 3, the Eroica. On the one hand, they tend to get clumped together because they represent the Second Symphony, particularly sort of the climax of his early period. And so it's generally seen to be Beethoven on the step of something greater. But on the other hand, if you listen to them one after the other, you realize that the Second Symphony is already a tremendous advance over the First Symphony in every respect, and a completely new world of expression as compared with the first, even though they both are basically kind of happy, fun pieces, and both of them respect the classical view of the symphony as something that was not the most important thing on the program, essentially. You know, the most important thing on the program was the concerto soloist, the virtuoso, the singer, whoever else was doing the solo stuff. Whereas a piece of abstract orchestral music as a feature event really didn't happen until Beethoven wrote the Eroica. Well, that's not true. It happened for Haydn's London symphonies. That was a sort of exception that proves the rule, a wonderful, unique moment that actually established the symphony as a meaningful attraction all by itself at a concert. But that didn't really happen in Vienna in the same way, and it was Beethoven who ratified that. And he did it with the Eroica, not with the first 2 symphonies, which were just sort of absorbed into the whirlwind of Viennese musical life. The Second Symphony actually attracted quite a bit of opprobrium when it was first performed. You know, there's that wonderful review in the Lexicon of Musical Invective that was, it's a hideous monster, a crass, vulgar, horrible, wounded dragon that refuses to die, and although severely wounded, flails about in the finale with its tail erect. Well, it actually does that. That happens to be, aside from the pejorative terminology, a very good description of the coda of the Second Symphony. And it tells us how far away Beethoven was moving and in the direction in which he was moving after the first. So I like putting them together. And I hope that will not be seen as something which is amiss or a dereliction of duty on my part, because really, like I said, the ones that have great firsts usually have great seconds, and there's no reason to make yourself nuts over trying to find different lists of performances of the 2 pieces individually. I just don't see the point. So that's my take on it. And so I just want to make this a relatively quick talk. There's one other musical point I want to make, since I've been talking mostly about the Second Symphony. I want to begin at the beginning and talk about the First Symphony, and specifically the beginning of the First Symphony. The opening of the First Symphony offers, I think, a tremendous illustration of some of the curiosities, the mythos, the difficulty in talking about music, and the problems that the way that we talk about music sometimes create for newcomers, or even people who know it for a long time and may be frustrated. Specifically, let's listen to the opening of the First Symphony, just the first few seconds, the first few chords, famous chords they are. And as usual, our example will be from the Paul Kletsky Beethoven cycle with the Czech Philharmonic, which is always, and has been throughout these talks, the silver thread of excellence on which we all depend. So here is the opening of the First Symphony. Charming, funny, delightful, isn't it? It's a little bit mysterious. Maybe you noticed that harmonically, because it begins with an ending, a dissonance resolving to a chord. Ya-dum. That's the end. And then it does it again. Ba-dum. On a different chord. And then finally, ya-dum-dum-dum, bwah. Then we finally hear what they call the tonic chord, which is the home key of the symphony. Now, this opening begins in what they call a position that they call off the tonic. In other words, it doesn't begin with the main key of the symphony. It begins with something else, and then it tries again with something else, and then finally it finds its way to the tonic. That's C major, by the way, is the tonic, the home key. That's a delightful opening. It's witty. It's a little bit humorous. It's sly. That's really the word. It's kind of, Beethoven was usually known as a composer who beat you over the head with a cudgel. But this was quite sophisticated and sly and charming. But what we're told about this opening is that it itself was revolutionary. Everybody says that. I even think someone like Leonard Bernstein said that in some talk he gave. Everybody talks about how amazing it was to begin a symphony like that off the tonic and only gradually, well, not too gradually, 10 seconds later, finding the tonic, and how that must have impressed audiences of the day and what a shock it must have been to their system. We don't know that any of that's true. We truly don't. Yes, the opening is very original. Beethoven was a very original composer. But then so were a lot of other composers. Haydn made a whole specialty of off-tonic symphonic allegro openings. Usually they were after an introduction or something, so we knew what key we were in, but that doesn't matter. I mean, his off-tonic openings sound even more off-tonic because you already know what key you're in. I'll give you an example. One of the most famous ones is the Oxford Symphony, number 92. And also, there's so many of them, number 86 in the Paris Symphonies. And, oh, goodness, what was the other one? The other one that I love so much, number 90. I mean, Haydn made a specialty of doing that sort of thing. The music begins elsewhere and then falls in, like off a cliff, and falls in. It lands on its feet in the home key of the symphony. So what Beethoven was doing wasn't all that unusual, and it wasn't as crazily original as some people would have us believe. But that's not really my point. My point is that the statement that, well, audiences in Beethoven's day would have been shocked, stunned, dazzled. We don't know that. We don't know that at all. We don't know that they heard anything unusual about it at all. I mean, they may have noticed that it's off the tonic. That is, that it has a certain mysterious or funny or witty quality. I mean, the music expresses what it expresses. And of course, if people are used to certain ways of listening to things, then a very different way of listening to something could be perceived as far more radical than it would be to us today. Because I listen to this and it sounds delightful. It sounds sly to me. It sounds witty. Does it sound like a shock, a revolution? No, not to my ears. It never has. And I'm very sick of being told it's supposed to sound that way, because people in Beethoven's time would have heard it that way. No one who says that knows what they're talking about. We have no idea what they would have thought, and we have absolutely no basis for believing that. Even if somebody at the time wrote about it and said, oh, what a surprising thing Beethoven did, that doesn't mean that's what people heard. That's how audiences reacted. So the reason I'm going on at such length about this is because there is so much hot air and gas being, flatulence, verbal flatulence surrounding this music. And one of the reasons that it has to be revolutionary is because Beethoven has to be revolutionary. Everything he did has to be revolutionary. The First Symphony is an extremely conservative piece of music, by the standards of what Beethoven was doing at the time. It had to be. It had to be because orchestral music had to be of a certain simplicity and lack of sophistication if it was going to be performed at all in those days, usually on 1 or 0 rehearsals, as a throwaway thing. And the orchestras, which, who knows how good they were, they would not play something that was too difficult or too tricky or too outside the beaten path. So it's okay. I mean, Beethoven was a genius. He worked within whatever parameters he was given to work. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with him operating within certain constraints because he did it without making concessions in terms of the quality of the musical result. So that's fine too. We don't have to hear everything that he did in terms of everything that he did later as a foreshadowing of the daring experiments to come, or as, a little soupçon, a taste of the, epic, volcanic, apocalyptic vision that would follow in the Eroica and the Fifth. We don't need to do any of that. So what I'm trying to say about the very opening of the first is, if it doesn't impress you as an earth-shattering moment in musical history, A, you aren't alone, and B, it's really okay to feel that way. That it's just cute. It's cute, it's lovable, it's fluffy, it's nice. And with that, let's just listen to the music for itself and enjoy it for what it is, not for what it's not, or for what it's supposed to be doing, or what later generations thought about Beethoven. And let's just see him for who he is, and enjoy these first 2 symphonies, because they're tremendously enjoyable music, even though they exist in a realm apart from the next 7. They really do. So, we've already talked about Kletsky and the Czech Philharmonic, which is definitely one of my performances of choix, of choice. You'll notice here that there will be no performances on period instruments. And the reason for that, I'm just going to say straight up front, is because they are no longer necessary. Much as I hate to say it, no, I love to say it. What's happened is that their whole orthodoxy and panoply of performance habits, good and bad, have been sucked up by regular, normal orchestras and normal ensembles and chamber orchestras. And everybody, they won the argument. Everybody's playing that way now, but they're doing it better. And they're doing it better because, quite frankly, the modern ensembles have the best players with the best instruments. They simply do. It's just like in Beethoven's day. If you have a regularly constituted ensemble that's been playing this music for the past 150 years, with an enormous tradition handed down under countless conductors, you're going to get a better result than you probably are going to be with a pickup ensemble of freelancers, however well drilled they may be. And that's what you get when you usually hear a period instrument performance. So I am perfectly content with doing period influenced performances, but for the most part on modern instruments. So there we are. First, Paul Kletsky with a Czech Phil. Next, another resolutely non-period. Well, these are all non-periody. Barenboim with the Staatskapelle Berlin. We haven't talked about these performances throughout this series. This is a superb Beethoven cycle. It really is. It doesn't have any weak links that I've noticed. And I wanted to do the first 2 because Barenboim, of course, fancies himself, Furtwängler's, next avatar. And Furtwängler never really did the first 2 Beethoven symphonies very well because he only did the heavy-duty, serious, philosophical, epic ones. And so I want to give Barenboim a bit of a shout out here. First of all, for the excellent work he did in this fantastic Beethoven cycle, but also to toss a hat to the validity of the German tradition, if we want to call it that, the German Viennese tradition of playing Beethoven, the Romantic tradition of Beethoven. I mean, that was part of the tradition of being Beethoven. I mean, Beethoven inaugurated the Romantic era, and playing his music that way, which was done for 100 years before the period instrument folks turned up, was perfectly legitimate, and it still is. And so I think Barenboim deserves credit for demonstrating the ongoing freshness and validity of a more romantic, traditional, if you want to call it Germanic, but traditional romantic way of playing Beethoven. In these first two symphonies, they're wonderful performances. Also wonderful is Günter Wand, another fabulous Beethoven cycle. See, I'm using this last talk as a kind of recapitulation, partly of some of the great Beethoven cycles we talked about, and also to just reintroduce some people who didn't get a lot of attention in some of the earlier talks. Now, this is really fabulous Beethoven cycle, one of the top handful, of Beethoven cycles. And again, Wand called himself an old conductor of the new school. In other words, he was a Toscanini follower in terms of how he interpreted and thought about music. But boy, oh boy, he combined sort of like, Toscanini's care for clarity and textural matters and line with the German Romantic schools, German Romanticism. It's just fantastic. These are as elegant and shapely and intelligent as you're ever going to hear in Beethoven's first two symphonies. But now we're going to do a couple in the period instrument style. And I have mentioned this cycle a few times because these performances are wonderful, wonderful. This is Thomas Dausgaard with the Swedish Chamber Orchestra on C-Max. Expensive and maybe hard to find, but they are wonderful. And they're wonderfully coupled because this is a series of the complete Beethoven orchestral music. So you get all kinds of rarities and little tchotchkes and things that you don't find. But this disc does have both the first two symphonies and my, oh my. And it comes with the music to einem Ritterballet, possibly Beethoven's earliest orchestral work. A suite of little dances. It's quite charming, and it's lovely to have coupled with the first two symphonies because you get to hear a serious evolution from the ballet to the First Symphony to the Second Symphony. I mean, the Second Symphony, I just want to say again, is really quite a bigger, more ambitious piece than people give it credit for. It really is. It has one of Beethoven's longest slow movements, for example, the Larghetto. It's gorgeous and very, very profound in expression. And it's only because the Eroica is so huge and gets so much attention that people have tended to overlook the Second Symphony. But if you put it with the first, I think that gives the Second Symphony its value as a genuinely thrusting, questing, interesting work. And it's so much better to do it that way than it is to say the thrusting, interesting quest consists of the first 5 seconds of the First Symphony, and then, having to somewhat overlook the second. Let's take Beethoven as he gave the music to us. So, Dausgaard on C-Max, marvelous. Oh, here's tradition on top of tradition. Oh, tradition. Oh, yeah. Hans Schmidt-Isserstedt. This is my choice for the Vienna Philharmonic's Best Beethoven Cycle on Decca, and it's out of print right now, and it had better come back from Eloquence or somebody because it should never be out of print. The performances are just marvelous, and the First and Second Symphony are entirely in keeping with that wonderful Viennese, Schmidt-Isserstedt was not a slouch. This is not Knappertsbusch. This is not somebody who didn't rehearse and just sort of did this and let the orchestra schmooze and flail and sort of do birdie doo-doo all over the music. No, not at all. It's far more disciplined than that. But by the same token, you do get a sense of that Viennese warmth and Gemütlichkeit in these performances. They're just splendid. Just what they should never be allowed to go out of print. Never. They're available in Japan on individual discs, by the way, on Japanese Decca, in case you see them there. So, Schmidt-Isserstedt, fabulous 1 and 2. Now, for the crazy school of Beethoven interpretation, Scherchen. Scherchen is everybody's favorite nutcase in Beethoven. He really is. He was one of the first to adopt Beethoven's metronome markings and take them seriously. He couldn't have cared less if the orchestra could play at those tempos. He just wasn't interested in knowing. He just went at it anyway. And the rough little bumps and warts, and as they say, and bruises and bumps and things that happened, that's what happened. But on the whole, it wasn't because, like Furtwängler, he was trying to approach some sort of cosmic oneness that was so fabulous that all kinds of mistakes happen along the way that your fans claim don't matter. Actually, there are fewer mistakes here than there are in most Furtwängler performances, despite the zany tempi. I think the difference is that with Scherchen, the orchestras just sound like they're having a blast. They're just having fun. They obviously know the music, so they're willing to give it a go. And there are moments where the ensemble's untidy and the balances are off and it's a little bit crude. But that, I think, is more of an authentic thing than just about anything the authenticity people, the period instrument people do. This is probably closer to what Beethoven really sounded like. And I just think this is a fantastic Beethoven cycle. It's so much fun. It's with with the Royal Philharmonic and the Vienna State Opera Orchestra, and and some other people, and the English Baroque Orchestra in the Grosse Fuga, which is on here. This is the Deutsche Grammophon reissue of Scherchen's cycle, but he must be heard in Beethoven. So Scherchen. Okay, back to the period instrument, young folk. Yes, who cares about young people, right? We don't. But this is a performance that I think really gives you the best of both worlds, and that's Paavo Järvi with the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie Bremen. What a fabulous group this is. I mean, boy, can they play. You've got all of the zip and bluster and impact and insanely fast tempos of the best period instrument ensembles with unbelievably immaculate, perfect playing, all of which goes to show that playing things badly, Mr. Scherchen here, right, wasn't necessarily desirable. In fact, it's wonderful to put these two things next to each other, because if you do, you've got totally the antithesis of the interpretation. You've got one that is based entirely on the modern concept of what historically informed performance is, and another which is just eccentric and based on what Hermann Scherchen's conception of what Beethoven performance is on modern instruments, and this is unquestionably more authentic sounding than this. This is so perfect. It is so streamlined. It is so it's almost unnatural. And nothing in Beethoven's day ever sounded like that, but we are freaking lucky that it does sound like this in our day. I mean, let's celebrate the unbelievable talent and ability, the sheer musical, technical polish and aplomb with which these people fling themselves at this music. And it doesn't suffer a bit for having been polished to a fine point. I mean, that would be like saying a rough diamond looks worse when you cut it correctly. I mean, it's just a nonsensical point of view. These are great Beethoven performances too. Wonderful. And we live at a time where greatness is always a possibility. It isn't always realized, but the potential is always there. And of course, isn't that always true? It was true back then, it's true now. 90% of what we hear is crap, 10% pure gold. Now we're going to do, let's see. Oh yeah, this is fun. This is really fun. Now I have a real sleeper. A really sleepy sleeper that probably none of you will have thought of, but I have loved these performances since I first heard them. Ensermé with the Orchestre de la Suisse Romande. As a Beethoven cycle taken as a whole, this has its ups and its downs, but I think these first two symphonies are just marvelous. They are pointed and elegant and sharp and wonderfully phrased and incredibly intelligent and shaped by a master, and gosh, they sound great. They sound absolutely great. If you don't know Ensermé in these two symphonies, Beethoven 1 and 2, give him a shot. This is the Australian Eloquence reissue. It also comes with the Eroica and number 4. And this is not Beethoven to sneer at. Yes, the orchestra is not fabulous, but they play awfully well in these 2 symphonies. And I think, Ulcermet had that classical poise. Partly it's a French thing. One of the things we've learned listening to Schuricht with the Paris Conservatory Orchestra is that Beethoven is a French composer. And hearing them do this music, we are reminded of that. So give Ulcermet a shot. You may be very, very surprised. But we're down to 2. Down to 2. Well, it was a tough choice, a very tough choice. But I can't leave this Beethoven survey without talking about Charles Mackerras. And this is his other cycle. I've been pushing his Royal Liverpool Philharmonic cycle on now Warner, what was EMI. But this is his Hyperion remake. These are live recordings with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra in 1 through 8 and the Philharmonia Orchestra in that other one, which shall remain nameless, the last one. And I think the guy was one of the great musicians of the 20th century. He did everything well. He had an incredible affinity for music of the classical period. He was a linchpin of the period instrument movement. He understood more about how this music ought to go between his own research and between his innate musicality than anybody else in the period instrument movement, as far as I'm concerned. And again, I would be remiss in taking leave of this Beethoven survey without recommending Mackerras. And I think his First and Second Symphonies are truly special because he hits all of the Haydn and Mozart-derived points with unfailing elegance while really emphasizing in a natural and effortless way all of those special little moments that make Beethoven Beethovenish. The sudden outburst, the little quirks of rhythm, the cut and thrust of the trumpets and drums. It's just wonderful. It's a joy, truly a joy to listen to. So Mackerras on Hyperion is wonderful. However, it's time to wrap up this party. And I've had a very hard choice coming down to one that I've chosen as sort of my favorite. But I do keep coming back to it, as much for the sound of the orchestra, just as with the Czech Phil, for example, and Kletsky, as much as for that as for the interpretations. And at the end of the day, it's Blomstedt with the Staatskapelle Dresden, because I think this is the most glorious German orchestra. I always prefer them to the Berlin Phil. Quite frankly, I think that they have the real German tradition. The real German tradition is a Central European orchestral tradition. It was not Karajan's uber-homogenized Berlin Philharmonic, which is what everyone told us, or what Karajan wanted us to believe was the German standard in Beethoven playing and Brahms playing. And it was marvelous. Do not get me wrong. I know you'll say, he hates Karajan. I don't. Karajan was a tremendous musician, and what he did with the Berlin Philharmonic was miraculous, and it could be superb, even in Beethoven, and even in these 2 symphonies. He did some very, very fine performances of them. That's not the point. Not the point at all. The point is that when you talk about schools of playing, the sound that you get from the Staatskapelle Dresden is much closer to the Czech Philharmonic than it would be to the Berlin Philharmonic. It's just a little bit darker. It's a little bit weightier in the bass, a little bit more covered in the woodwind sonorities, but otherwise there's that same transparency of texture, that wonderful unblended sonority. And this is the young Blomstedt, who has done a wonderful old age Beethoven cycle with the Gewandhaus of Leipzig on its own label. That's a fabulous Beethoven cycle. But this one I just think has a freshness and a clarity and a naturalness. I don't know. It's just special to me, truly special to me. And so with Blomstedt and the brilliant Staatskapelle Dresden, this was originally on Berlin Classics, and it was on Brilliant Classics. I think it's still on both. This is a Berlin Classics reissue. that's come out recently, but you can still get it much, much less cheaper on Brilliant Classics. It doesn't matter how you get it. By now, you probably have it, or you heard me tell you to get it or suggest that you get it is often enough. And I hope that you do, because the end is the beginning, as they say. You know, this is the alpha and omega of Beethoven 1 and 2 performances. Blomstedt with the Staatskapelle Dresden. It's an orchestra that you should hear in this repertoire. And with that, my friends, we come to the end of this Beethoven Symphony Countdown. It has been a thrilling journey, one that I have been delighted to share with you, and I thank you so much for sharing it with me, for sharing your time, your attention, your comments. It's just been great. And I look forward to talking about more Beethoven, because there's no shortage of new stuff coming and new cycles and new things. And we'll see what happens now that the Beethoven year is over, whether it calms down a bit or whether it just keeps on coming. But whatever happens, we shall keep on listening. I know you will, and I will too. And I truly look forward to continuing these conversations about the music that we all love so well. Take care, my friends.